This is where it takes me to. And I think you're going to disagree, but I want to hear you on why you're going to disagree with this. My opinion, when Reagan came, overnight, Khomeini gave the prisoners of war. You remember that. And Reagan gave the credit to Carter. When they said, hey, you know, they're releasing the prisoner of war, and Reagan could have taken the credit because Khomeini knew Reagan's going to do something about it. He didn't feel like Carter was going to do anything about it. He thought Carter was just a nice president. Nobody feared. And Reagan said it's because of Carter. He gave the credit to him. As much as 80 million people voted against this guy named, I don't know if you've heard of his name, Donald J. Trump, right? They voted against this guy. And 76 whatever million people voted for him. While he was president, we may have had a lot of riots. We may have had a lot of protests in the U.S. We may have had a lot of stuff that was going on in the U.S. Nobody even talked about ISIS for 4 years. Nobody talked about anything. He put China, held them accountable with all the issues that was going on with the sanctions and everybody else. So there was a certain level of fear to know that no one was going to do anything under him. Do you think a situation like this gives the opposing side an argument to say, well, this is exactly why they didn't fear Trump. If Trump was in the House right now, this would have never happened. That's what you hear millions of people talking about right now. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on this.
Well, when we speak about Afghanistan, I believe that the Biden and the Trump administration almost had the similar objectives. And when I say similar objectives, both of them wanted no boots on ground. Both of them wanted a similar exit strategy. And both of them did not want any kind of an interference from the United States anymore in the internal situation in Afghanistan. Now, many believe, I've seen those tweets, I've seen articles being written, columns being written, and many experts arguing that if Trump was here, perhaps this was not going to be an exit strategy. I personally do not believe that. I think that the exit strategy would have been similar. You know, there was no detailed planning of even how the Bagram airbase should have been kept till the last moment. And I think whatever the military commanders down on ground advised the Biden administration, the same advice would have been gone to the Trump administration, and similar action would have been taken. Secondly, you know, when it comes to China, one has to realize and study the pattern that China has really got into in the region, their dynamics to become a superpower. And when in 2012, 2013, Xi Jinping came to power, his entire project, his speeches about China Dream, his vision of China Dream, and his tendency of expansionist tendency, his vision of China's expansion across the region and the globe. You know, we've faced this here in India, where just last year, after 40 long years, we had a situation in Ladakh, the northernmost part of India, where the Chinese came in and there was a confrontation and 20 Indian soldiers lost their lives. We also had a situation in the same confrontation. Many of the Chinese soldiers were killed. Some figures say that there were 30 to 40 Chinese soldiers, but China never, as it always happens, they never came up with a figure. Later, a year later, they came out that 6 or 7 of their senior soldiers were killed in that confrontation. So the expansionist tendency has been there time and again. Another important factor of economic upheaval that China engages in is the debt trap. It has done that in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, in many places in African region, in somewhat places in the Middle East also, Djibouti and others. So this debt trap is something that China is going to exploit in Afghanistan as well. Now, how it does that with the Taliban is something that one needs to see, because Taliban does not have any kind of a recognition or diplomatic recognition right now from any of the global countries. There are only a handful that are willing to cooperate and go along with them, apart from, of course, the United Nations humanitarian aid that will come in. But how will the debt trap strategy really work in Afghanistan? I'm curious about that. I'm really curious about how China takes about the important infrastructure projects in Afghanistan, because, you know, it's Soviet Union has been there, has done that. The United States has been there, done that. And they have seen the failure of their any kind of a situation of nation building or any kind of a governance with such ethnic strife, with such kind of a, even illiteracy out there. So how will China manage is something that one needs to witness, because it could be, again, Patrick, that a decade from now, you would be interviewing me or I would be interviewing you, and we will be discussing how China is now exiting Afghanistan. So it would be a similar situation. But you started your question comparing the Biden administration's policies with the Trump administration.
Or Carter, Trump or Carter. Like the similarities between Carter and Biden, and then how Trump would have had military go last rather than military go first. Because my challenge is purely a sequencing challenge. Why did military leave first? You leave military last before you get everybody out. So that's the biggest difference between Trump's exit. The objective is the same. No one's saying, first of all, Trump never wanted to go in there anyways in the first place. 20 years ago, he did a whole article about the fact that, going against Bush. I don't know if it was New York Times or USA Today. So he's never wanted to be there. But to leaving with soldiers last rather than leaving with, that's why I'm asking about the sequencing side. And then comparing Biden and Carter as being nice people, but does the world fear those two? I think history says no.
Well, I agree with you, but I'll give you one example, and this is where I will end this particular argument. What the United States did in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, apart from the military occupation that happened, they let a corrupt regime prosper. They let drug mafia and drug growth, heroin, hashish, ganja, and opium grow massively. This is what they did. There was a point, and perhaps I don't have the latest figures right now with me, but 93 to 95% of the global heroin and opium came from Afghanistan. I mean, the kind of killings that are happening all across the globe, the drug mafia killing, the drug lords, etc., their production, their entire epicenter was in Afghanistan. And secondly, be it Hamid Karzai or be it Ashraf Ghani, of course, has become the latest villain and a punching bag, perhaps, for the United States. They were corrupt. I mean, everybody knew this. The US knew this. The NDS knew it. The regional governments here in South Asia knew it. And still, they let them prosper. I mean, there was no mechanism of transparency or some kind of, questions being asked anywhere. So this led to a complete collapse as well, where, you have a government which only works for money, which knows that the US is going to arm you and give you a lot of protection and give you money. And that's your end goal. Your end goal is not peace. Your end goal is not transparency. Your end goal is not to keep your flock together and keep all tribes and ethnic people together. So I think the United States failed in that miserably as well, where they could not check, one, the menace of drugs, second, the menace of a corrupt government that only grew further, and third, and the most important, which I emphasize, the menace of a nexus between the Pakistan ISI, the Taliban, and mushrooming the terror groups, Sunni Islamist terror groups, which are anyway now even going to grow further. So these are the terrible mistakes that have happened. Of course, I completely agree with you that the least and the basic thing that perhaps even any strategist from any of the top universities in US would have told them is that the military needs to stay till the very end. You need to evacuate each and every citizen first.
Yeah, and by the way, that's not even Democratic or Republican. That's not politics.
Yes.
That's just basic military strategy. So who do you think ought to be, and you may or may not have an opinion on this, who ought to be held accountable in the sequence of how we left? Who is supposed to be held accountable for the way we left Afghanistan?
I think it is Biden. I mean, Biden and nobody else. I mean, Trump, of course, because the kind of timelines that he set up were unrealistic. I mean, May 1st, it was impossible to, in fact, evacuate not just American citizens, other citizens from other countries, or Afghan SIV applicants and others who, anyway, many of them are still stranded there. And the timelines were unrealistic completely, could not have been fulfilled. Now, Biden says that there were timelines set and he had to abide by it, is something that I do not agree with. What are negotiations for? What is your leverage for? Why are you called a superpower over the last many decades? So I think they had a certain amount of leverage. They had a huge amount of leverage in the negotiations, and they could have pushed this further.
I agree.
And a strategy of collapse that completely happened, where the military would have advised them, because their focus was not, mind you, Patrick, to evacuate people. Their focus was to evacuate their military. So their strategy, if you go to Biden's statements in the past, if you go to statements of Blinken or even other diplomats, they say repeatedly that these are the many troops that will remain. These are the many troops that will remain and will exit finally. So their focus was not on these many thousand innocents that will be evacuated. So let's face it, that now Blinken might create a show all across the globe that we rescued more than 100,000 people, and that was a major task. In the process, 13 US soldiers also lost their life. But the reality of the matter is that they never wanted to rescue citizens. That was not their priority. Their priority was to exit this conflict that was created by the United States, a monster that was created, and perhaps a monster that will remain for the Afghan people and perhaps the remaining few Afghan citizens.
So if you like this little short clip from an interview I did, click over here to watch the entire interview. And please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.